Thanks, Mark. Well, good evening. I'm going to start by talking about some of the projects that we're working on this year. You can see a lot of dots on the map here. So each one of those dots is a project that we'll be working on for 2024. The blue dots are age projects, so that's where we're working on old line. You can see that's the bulk of what we're doing. We do 75 miles every year replacing of old infrastructure. The yellow dots are what we call system improvements. So that's where we're building tie lines or increasing capacity. Typically that has old line as well. And the one red dot is our substation that we're rebuilding. We rebuild one substation every year. We have 46 substations, so they have about a 40-year life, so we rebuild one every year. That one's up in Sand Lake. And then, so some of the projects I'm going to go through, we'll start here with this dot 24. So that project is about 3 miles of overhead that we're rebuilding along 82nd Avenue Northeast. It's kind of between Lake Vermilion and Sugar Lake. We've got some age and some growth. Then working our way down at dot 29 is Longville. We've got 3.5 miles of overhead that we're going to replace for age, and a half mile of that will bury underground. And that's along County Road 125 Northeast. Crews brought that up as an area that had some excessive maintenance. That's why we're putting some of that underground. And the rest of it was old line. Working our way over at 19 is Pine Lake. You might be familiar with that south of Whippold. We got about a mile that we're going to put underground in that area. And then above that is another job we're doing out in that Onegum area. It's on Breezy Point Road. It's about 1.5 miles of overhead that we'll replace and another mile of underground. Again, that was a crew submittal and some agent growth. Working our way up dot 27, that's over in Bena. So that's about a little over half a mile of underground that we're putting in for agent growth. That's by Nodak Resort and then over to the general store if you're familiar with that area. Working our way back up, dot 28 is kind of on the west side of Winnie. So that's about 1.5 miles of overhead on the West Winnie Road for agent growth. We've had a lot of growth on that side of the lake. And wrapping it up with dot 22 up to the north is Ball Club. It's about 3 miles of line that we're going to bury along Highway 46. Kind of in that Cutfoot Sioux Narrows area. Oh, go back here. So I'd like to talk next about some of the right-of-way. So if you're familiar with our system, we break it down by substations. So we have, like I said, the 46 substations. We do a seventh of it every year. So we break it up into sevenths. And then you can see this time we're kind of in the middle of the area. We're doing about 917 miles. It's about $6.2 million. So we spend a substantial amount of money on the right-of-way because this is where we have our biggest impact on reliability, is cutting the trees. So we're on our second time going through the entire system. We've already done it once. So we're about halfway through. We're on our 4th year of the second time. The first year, hopefully you saw that when we went through the first time, the last 7 years, we kind of reestablished those corridors. So we cleaned up everything underneath the lines. But this time, we're focusing on those dead and dying trees on the periphery. We call those danger trees. So if you see dead and dying trees that are outside the right-of-way, you can call those in. We're happy to come out and take those free charge. They are a proactive way that we can get rid of a tree issue that would probably cause an outage down the road. And like I said, all of these tie to reliability. So these are our 3 main reliability indices that we measure. The green line is the number of outages that we have. The red line is the amount of time it takes our crews to respond. And the blue line is the number. I'm sorry, the green line is the duration. The blue line is the number. And so you can see all of those are trending in the right direction. They're trending downward, largely due to the things that we've done, like investing in the right-of-way and investing in replacing old infrastructure, age projects. We do have a new tool this year that we can use to proactively go after some of our outages that are happening. So we have a device that we can drive the line and it will see if there's components on the line that are failing before they fail. It's been a pretty valuable tool. So what we did is we ranked all of our feeders based on the number of outages that we've had due to faulty components. And you can see Winton up in Ely, that Ely area by far and above had the most outages due to components. Next was kind of that Fraser Bay area, which is south of Lake Vermilion. And then Sturgeon Lake, which is down on the southern part of the system. So those are the 3 areas we're going to really focus on this year. We'll be driving those areas and trying to proactively get some of that equipment off the system before it fails. So if you remember, probably about 5 years ago, we started hiring some internal labor to take the place of some of the contract services we had. It used to be that we had a contractor that would come out when you called in a tree on your property and said, I've got a tree impacting my line, I'd like to have somebody come out and take it. That's a free service that we provide but it used to be a contractor. Well, we looked at that and thought, you know, this really should be a Lake Country Power employee. If they're going to be in your yard, talking to you, dealing with you in your home, that really should be an employee, not a contractor. So we tried to bring that in-house. We also, when we did the business case for that, we found that we could save money. And those guys, when we hired 5 tree crew members back in about 5 years ago, in 2019, they saved us between $200,000 and $300,000 every year. So that we have been able to save money. We've seen customer satisfaction surveys improve. So we hope that that's been a good service. And if you do have trees in your yard, please call them in. We're happy to come out and take those for you free of charge. Last year, the guys did about just shy of 1,000 trees of that type. They also removed 350 danger trees, those dead and dying trees I talked about on the periphery of the right-of-way. So they went out and did that. And then we've also used them to, if you remember, I mentioned that our right-of-way budget is $6.2 million. It's one of our biggest budget components. So we utilized our internal guys to save some of that money by working on some of the projects where we could, just to try to save costs. And that worked out so well for us that 3 years ago we hired 10 linemen to do construction. So you saw those blue dots I had on the system where we're doing the 75 miles of age-related system improvements. Well, we can do 45 of that in-house with those 10 linemen, and that's proved to be really good. The first year that we had them on board, they saved us over $1 million over what we would have paid a contractor to do that same body of work. And last year, you know, they did a little over 40 miles, and they came in under budget. So up above and beyond what we would have saved over the contractor prices, they came in $250,000 under what we even budgeted them to do. So they've really been working hard, doing a good job. And frankly, if we didn't have them on staff, we would have had 40 miles that we wouldn't have been able to do last year because there wasn't contractor availability. All the contractors were all booked up. So it's worked out well for us. And with that in mind, we asked the board this last year if we could hire a bore crew. So when we put in underground cable, there's really 3 ways we can do that. We can use an excavator and dig it in. We can use a cable plow, which looks like a trencher, and trench it in. Or we can use a bore rig, which is a horizontal drill, and it actually pushes it in hydraulically. This is the one piece of work that we don't have the equipment. We have cable plows, we have excavators, but we don't have a bore rig. So we're 100% reliant on the contractor to do this body of work. So we took a look at that and we said, well, it would be nice to be able to prioritize this. It's being used more and more because we're trying to get around, you know, septic systems, other infrastructure. So it has a big place. We figured we could do about 32,000 feet, and that we could probably save almost half of what we're paying the contractor. So another opportunity to save some money and hopefully do a better job at the same time. We won't be able to hire them probably until the beginning of next year, though, because as Tracy mentioned, we are still feeling some supply chain issues. We probably won't be able to get the equipment for them till the end of the year, so it makes sense to hit the ground running next year, and that's probably what we'll do. And I'll finish it up talking about some grants. So we did put in for about $21.5 million worth of grant funding that's out there. A lot of it was stuff that we would have done anyways, but if we can take advantage of some of these grant funds and alleviate some of our rate pressure, it's a good thing. So we're doing $12 million on old lines, all those old projects I talked about. $8 million on substation hardening. We do 1 sub every year, and when we do our new substations, they're underground. So you can kind of see, I know it's not a very good picture, but in the background you can kind of see the boxes. That's what our new substations look like. It's a bunch of green boxes. There's no longer all that bus work and all the exposed equipment. All of that's locked, protected, not exposed to weather, not exposed to animals. So it falls under that hardening that this grant money is there for, so we can utilize it and alleviate hopefully some of the rate pressure over the next 5 years as we rebuild some of these old ones. And finally, we got 17,000 load control receivers that we are changing out. We've changed out a little over 3,000, so we got about 14,000 left. But we're able to get $1.5 million hopefully to offset the cost of that. And I know Dan Cooper, our Key Accounts and Business Development Manager, is going to talk to you more about some of those programs. So with that, I'll turn it over to him to do the heavy lifting from here. Thanks.
All right, well, thanks, Derek. I don't know how much heavy lifting I'll be doing. I'm not that big of a guy here. Again, hello everybody. I'm Dan Cooper, Key Accounts and Business Development Manager. I work with our commercial accounts, talk rates, rebates, and all the programs, formerly a lineman, so I used to work and build and do some of the work Derek just talked about there. So today here, I was asked to talk a little bit about our programs and demand side management. You know, some of you may participate in some of the programs, but we wanted to kind of touch base on broadly what they are, and then why are we doing them as a cooperative, and how does it benefit everybody. So first, we'll go over some basics, but when you think about, bills and everything, a lot of people just are familiar with usage, which is how much electricity do I use in a month? You look at your bills, you say, I used X amount of kilowatts this month times our rates. So what you may not be, I guess, familiar with would be demand and demand-side management. Demand-side management is just kind of a fancy word for our programs. In demand, it's not as similar as usage. We'll get into it. So with that, I want you to meet Mr. Grid. If you want to know the super heavy-duty technical details, you can talk to Derek all day long about that. I myself like to make this complex topic of demand a little more simple. And so here's what we have is a picture, very athletic guy doing a pretty healthy lift, lifting some weights over his head. This guy represents our power grid. So Mr. Grid himself, that body, is representing the grid and all the components we have. So that's our substations, our lines, our equipment, basically anything that takes and makes power from the generation all the way to your doorstep. That's the equipment. And the weight and the lift is the electrical load. That's all of our load combined. What this grid is always consistently trying to do is just meet the demand of our load. So we'll get into it again. The grid, that's like the muscle of this guy. That's our substations, our equipment, transmission, distribution line, all put together trying to lift this electrical load, which is the weight. And the weight is the demand. So system electric load, everything this building combined with all the other buildings in Remer all put together throughout our whole service territory, that's our load and that is the weight. That's what Mr. Grid or our grid is always trying to lift. So what adds weight? If we're saying our system electric load is weight, and we talk about a lot of things that you guys may, contribute to that lift for that guy. So we have HVAC, water heating, maybe you have an electric vehicle, and then we have quite a bit of, motor load, electric motor load through some of our businesses. We're not too far away from Savannah Pallets. They have quite a bit of load. They add quite a bit of weight. Whereas you may have a space heater or something in your house or some electric water heat, which is just a little bit of weight, but that aggregate is a heavy lift for Mr. Grid. And so we're talking demand. Demand is that weight, that lift. So you'll hear a little bit from probably Mark later on peak demand. What is peak demand? It's just that. It's when that lift or that load is super, super heavy. Traditionally, you're going to get a very high peak demand or a heavy lift during the really hot days. Everybody turns on their air conditioners. Lots of us have it going. So high, hot weather, lots of AC load, lots of peak demand. Now, in the opposite, you think of some of the coldest weather we have. Living where we live, unfortunately, you wouldn't think of it, but yeah, it gets cold around here, not on today, which is like May weather, but that puts a lot of demand. That's a lot of stress and a lot of load for Mr. Grid here to lift mainly because of our heating loads. We have a lot of electric heat up in this part of the world, and that puts a lot of work on it. So the heavier the demand or the heavier the lift system electric load, the harder those muscles are going to have to work to meet that. Our transformers, lines, equipment, all of that. And with that, the harder the work, the more money it costs to meet that. That's burning more fuel at generation. Maybe this lift is getting so big that Derek has to have his crews there go out and upgrade some lines. So when Derek talks about substation hardening and age-related line replacements and all these things, what he's essentially trying to do is make sure that those muscles are healthy and they're always ready to meet that demand or make that lift, which is what our cooperative and the members here would expect. I mean, you want your stuff to work, so we're putting money into always meeting that demand and always making sure that that's there and we can reliably make that lift. So to meet the demand, then we have two options here. We can add more muscle. That's expensive. That would mean, bigger power lines, more generation, substations. I mean, basically, you think about like the beefiest guy, he's athletic, but just a really big, meathead guy. We could do that, or we could get more efficient. We could make those lifts better by keeping those muscles healthy. But, essentially, more aligned substation generation plants is one option, but we would prefer to manage that demand or make that lift more efficient, and that's what demand side management is and our programs. So we'll go through them. We're not going to go real in depth with all our programs, but we'll touch base briefly on what we offer and why we offer it. So we call demand side management programs Lake Country Power money saving programs. If you go on our website, you want to learn about them, that's what you'll see. So what is that? Off-peak heating, dual fuel heating, water heating, or off-peak or interruptible. We have some cycled air conditioning, and then we have some programs for commercial and industrial members. So what is off-peak? Off-peak is like lifting the weight later. So we talk about that peak demand time. There's a lot of stress on the grid. Maybe it's super hot or super cold. There are some loads that we can do. We can lift those loads later, or essentially, maybe we don't need to, add that load to the grid now. We can get away with doing it later instead of those peak demand times. Good example is off-peak water. Maybe you have a 100-gallon water heater at your house. Do you need to heat that water at 3 or 4 o'clock on the hottest day when everybody's running their air conditioner? Or can you get by with 20 gallons of hot water and then, finish heating it up at maybe 11 or 12 at night when that peak is not there? Dual fuel and interruptible, and this is kind of like lifting a lot of weight but then taking a 15-minute break. Instead of continually lifting or meeting that peak demand, maybe you have some loads that you can just cycle or shut off for a little bit, like your air conditioner. It's running on a hot day, you're contributing to that lift, and then you can take, a little bit of weight off Mr. Grid there for 15 minutes and then jump back into it when you need, and you might not really notice a big difference in comfort. You might not notice the comfort, but it actually has a pretty big impact on that grid demand and helps us reduce that. And then commercial and industrial programs. This is like essentially during those peak demand, taking the day off. Maybe instead of lifting all this heavy weight, some of it we can just do tomorrow. Some of our larger commercial members will do this, and they'll either switch to a generator, which takes all that load or that weight off of the lift and onto a generator, or they can just pause their work for the day and come back tomorrow and maybe do it when the system demand is not as heavy. So why do our members participate in these, and how does it benefit them? The simple, for the participating members who participate in these programs, you get a direct discount on your rates. Residential members will see rates, roughly half or somewhere in there. And then our commercial members who participate, they get a discount on their usage and their demand. What if you don't participate? Why does this benefit you? All of these programs that we participate in allow us to purchase power at a cheaper rate or reduce our demand. So with all that peak demand or that high demand time that we're buying power, like anything, when you have a high demand, you're going to have higher prices. If we can reduce the amount of power that we have to purchase during those high demand times by shedding some of our load or reducing that lift, then we can purchase wholesale power at basically take a little bit of pressure or purchase it at times when it's not so expensive. So that kind of puts downward pressure on our rates together as a whole. So even if you're not directly participating in them, you'll benefit a little bit from that. And then the other thing is these programs, like I mentioned, we have two ways to meet that load. We can either beef up our substations and our equipment and essentially add more muscle, which costs more money for all of us. If we can meet that load and reduce that demand, that means we can get by with maybe a little smaller substation or a little less heavy-duty equipment, and then all of those purchases combined go into our essentially paid through our rates. So if we can more efficiently meet that demand and use these programs, we can put downward pressure on our rates as a whole for all our cooperative. So that's all I got. I'll be around after if anybody wants to talk more about our programs. Tracy Wertenen, our CFO, is up next. Thanks.
Thank you. Good job. Thanks. All right, good evening, everybody. As Dan said, I'm Tracy. I'm the Chief Financial Officer here at Lake Country Power. Thanks for everybody coming out tonight. Nice to be back here in Remer. My part of the conversation is much more entertaining than Mr. Grid. I get to talk about finances and financial information. So to get into it, my part of our conversation, we'll talk about the preliminary 2023 financial results, look a little bit at 2024 and the year ahead, talk briefly about some supply chain and material costs. Then I'll mix it up a little bit, talk about the Operation Roundup program, and then a high-level view of what we're doing at Lake Country Power for cybersecurity. So taking a look at this first slide, the good news was that 2023 proved to be a pretty decent year for us financially. A good chunk of that stems from Great River Energy. They had a historically good year financially, but there was more than that worked in our favor last year. This graph that you're looking at here represents where our 2023 revenue came from. The overall revenue dollars might change a little bit from year to year, but this picture really doesn't vary much for us. We had $106 million in revenue earned last year, and as you can see by looking at the blue piece of the graph or of that pie chart, 75% of our revenue every year is residential. The bulk of our kilowatt hour sales and our revenue earned comes from our residential members. 24% commercial industrial last year, and then a little bit other. Those are miscellaneous fees and so on and so forth that we may charge throughout the year. Also included in this year, the $106 million was a revenue deferral. Basically, we shifted $5 million from 2023 revenue to 2024. I'll touch on that a little bit more in a later slide. This slide represents where we used that revenue last year. It shows our operating expenses, and again, how all that $106 million from last year was used throughout the year. Our total cost of electric service in 2023 was $99 million. We had about a $7 million operating margin last year, which for Lake Country Power was fairly healthy. As you can see in this graph, the bulk of our expenses are purchase power costs. As Dan was talking about, any way we can lower that demand, try to find ways to offset those power costs is good for us, because at least 50% every year of our operating expenses are consumed by purchase power. We did have several unanticipated favorable outcomes last year. Purchase power cost credits from Great River Energy had an impact on that 51% that you see there. We were credited back almost $3 million from Great River Energy. Again, I mentioned they had a favorable year. There's a lot that goes into it, but their favorability benefited us as well. We only had one major storm event last year. The bulk of that would show up in the distribution, operation, and maintenance expense. It's very, very rare that we would have only one major storm event. That had impact on our operating costs, overtime costs, equipment costs, fuel costs. Very rare occasion, but it was very beneficial to us. We also received confirmation towards the end of the year that we would receive funding from the state of Minnesota for some of the major storms we had back in 2022. So we had a large storm in June and December of 2022. We received confirmation at the end of just this past year that the state was going to reimburse us 75% of expenses that we could attribute to those two events. Again, the end result was operating margins of $7 million, which is fairly healthy for us. I just want to mention that that $7 million ultimately gets allocated back to our membership in the form of capital credits. So in May, June, you'll get an allocation letter showing you what your portion of the capital credits will be for 2023. And then looking at this year ahead, probably the best news I can share is that we have no rate increases planned this year for our commercial or residential members. That includes our load management programs, and again, it utilizes a $5 million revenue deferral, which is a shift from last year to 2024. Just to touch on that a little bit, it isn't something that Lake Country Power can just choose to do. We have to have an outstanding or a one-time economic event. We have to seek approval from the Rural Utility Service, as well as our board has to approve that revenue deferral. So that $5 million will help us get through 2024 with no anticipated rate increases. The way this winter has been so far, we're going to need every penny of that $5 million. Our sales are, I love no winter. I love no winter personally, but professionally it has an impact. So, and again, we do continue to see some rising costs, as Derek briefly mentioned. Our wholesale power costs are anticipated to increase a bit this year. Rising interest rates. We do borrow a fair amount annually of the construction work plan, which is what some of the stuff Derek was talking about earlier. So as those interest rates rise, we experience larger interest costs, and over a 30 or 35 year period of the loans, that tends to add up. They've more than doubled in the last 2 years. So that has impact on us as well. And material and equipment costs, there has been some stability, but we are still seeing some increases overall. This graph is just an example of some of the rising costs we've seen in our commonly used materials that you'll see out on a utility line. These increases date back looking at June of 2020 to basically the beginning of 2024. As you can see, several of them are triple digits. Things have definitely leveled off, but if you were to go back to January of 2020, we would have been paying 111% less for that pole mount transformer. And again, things have leveled, but I don't foresee that we're going to see pre-COVID prices. Things may come down a little bit, but I don't think we're going to get back there, unfortunately. So another thing that Derek mentioned earlier too about bringing in those bore crews, equipment is still a challenge to get in many respects. You can now go out to a car lot and buy a new car, generally, but some of that larger, more specialized equipment still has significant lead times, so that does have impact on us. And one thing I will say about the team at Lake Country Power, the last few years for everybody have been really challenging, but through it all, we've learned how to adjust, we've learned how to better prepare, and we've really learned how to successfully work through the challenges that we faced over the past several years. That's only going to make us better and stronger moving into the future. And then just changing things up a little bit, I'm going to talk about our Operation Roundup program. And I would venture to say that through the challenges we've seen over the past several years, this program has proven to be even more valuable over the past several years. For those of you who are not familiar with Operation Roundup, it's a charitable program that's unique to electric cooperatives and is designed to provide financial assistance to nonprofit organizations and other groups within our service territory. And that statement at the top, a little change makes a big difference, really is true. For less than $1 a month, you can choose to give back to the community by rounding up your electric bill. In 2023, through member giving, we donated over $210,000 to about 125 different organizations throughout our service territory. So it really is impactful. And you can see that over $3.2 million donated since we started the program back in October of 2004. So for those of you who do participate in the program, we thank you. If you are interested and you don't currently participate, please reach out to our office. We can help you get that set up. And lastly, but certainly not least, I'll briefly touch on cybersecurity. We just want to let you, our membership, know that protecting your data is really extremely and of the utmost importance to us at Lake Country Power. Our IT department works diligently every day, 24/7, to make sure we're doing all that we can to keep your data safe. We take a proactive approach. We continually monitor anything coming into our system, information going out of our system, to ensure that our members' data remains as safe and secure as we can possibly keep it. We also work with NRECA, which is our National Electric Cooperative Organization, as well as other co-ops throughout Minnesota and the country, to develop new technology, infrastructure, to learn from each other, and to work cooperatively together to keep data and our electric grid as safe as we possibly can. And with that, I will turn it over to our general manager, Mark Bach.
Don't walk away with my mic.
Oh, gosh.
Thanks, Tracy. If you thought Mr. Grid was exciting and Tracy's stuff was entertaining, have I got a deal for you? I get to talk legislative and regulatory stuff that's impacting us. If you came to the meeting last year, you heard some of this, but certainly not all of it. There's some updated things in here. But I'm going to start with some opening remarks on this. I'm going to say some things that are critical, and they're critical of our elected leaders. They're critical of regulators. Please don't confuse that with political. I would say these things regardless of which political party was in power. Reliability and affordability that I'm going to get into, those are not partisan issues. That impacts everybody. So this is not political. It will be critical, though. It may seem a bit negative or a bit pessimistic. I will offer to you that it's realistic. I'm going to give you a side of this that you're not really hearing from many other people, but we need to have this conversation. We're at a point where policy needs to meet reality on this energy front and this transition to green energy. If we're going to make this work, policy's got to meet reality. So the 2024 legislative session, they're about a month in right now. It's an election year. The president's on the ballot, the entire United States House of Representatives. Senator Klobuchar's on the ballot, the entire state House of Representatives. The governor and the legislative leadership coming into this session have told us, largely going to leave you alone. We've done enough to you. And we're really going to focus on getting a bonding bill done and not much else. We'll see. So far a month in, they've dabbled in issues important to us again. I expect there's some stuff coming. We will have to play some defense on a few issues. We will oppose any new mandates, whether that's mandates on energy storage or mandates on new renewable energy. One I'm going to touch on that's up here is diversity mandates. You might ask, why would Lake Country Power be up here saying we'll oppose diversity mandates? The reason I'm saying that is the mandates that are being talked about are diversity in hiring. We would oppose that because we need to hire based on merit. We need to hire the most qualified people, regardless of whatever your gender or your race or religious beliefs. We don't care. The job is too hazardous to hire any other way. So if there's something that comes out, a bill introduced about mandating diversity in hiring, and you see Minnesota's co-ops are opposed to that, that's why. We will advocate for some permitting reform. There's lots of different business segments that are advocating for this. Where it's important to us is on a transmission front. Permitting transmission lines is really burdensome right now. There needs to be some reform to that. And then in the form of environmental permitting. Permitting to build our lines, permitting to build the transmission lines. We need some reform in that too, and that's both federal and state. So we'll advocate for that. Advocate for lifting the nuclear moratorium in the state of Minnesota. What that is right now, there's a total ban on building any nuclear generation in the state of Minnesota. If we're going to be successful in a transition to a zero carbon future and going to keep the lights on at the same time, we need to get serious about zero carbon nuclear energy. If we 24/7, 365. But right now, nobody will look at it in the state of Minnesota because you couldn't build it anyway. And by lifting that moratorium doesn't mean somebody's going to build it. It just means they can investigate it and see if it could work. So carbon-free by 2040 legislation. This passed and was signed by the governor just about a year ago. I think it was February 7th of last year. First, let's start with what it is. What it says is energy for retail sales in the state of Minnesota needs to come from carbon-free sources, and there's some milestones in there. 2030 is the first one. It's 80% by 2030. We were able to get that knocked down to 60% for consumer-owned utilities, which are co-ops and municipalities. So that first benchmark for us will be 60% in 2030. That's not very far from now. But we all have to be 90% by 2035 and 100% carbon-free by 2040. In utility planning, that's the blink of an eye. It would take that long to permit a large transmission line, let alone make a transition to 100% clean energy. And I'll get into some details on that. Another piece that the legislation did was increase the renewable energy standard in Minnesota. If you remember the 25% renewable by 2025 law, I think from 2007, That's now 55% renewable by 2035. So renewable and carbon-free are not the same thing. Renewable is wind, solar, some hydro, but carbon-free includes other sources that, some of the biomass generation is considered carbon-free, nuclear is considered carbon-free, so they're not the same. That's why I mentioned them different. Concerns on this, and I'll get into each one in some detail. Reliability and affordability are obvious ones, but local control, and I'll explain that when I get to it. Start with reliability. What this is going to do is it'll put a heavy reliance on intermittent sources of power generation, namely wind and solar. Is how a lot of people's plans to get this done is. That's unreliable, intermittent. You don't know if it's going to be windy, when it's going to be sunny, where it's going to be windy, where it's going to be sunny. The technology to do this isn't fully developed, certainly not deployed. I talk in alphabet soup a lot. I'll mention MISO a few times. MISO is the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator. Simpler terms, that's the regional grid that we're a part of in the central part of the state. I'll show you a map in a little bit. They had warnings prior to this legislation and since of potential energy shortfalls. So this legislation will exacerbate some of that. And then studies that MISO have done have shown that once you eclipse about that 40% renewables penetration, the grid becomes just exponentially unreliable. So let's put some data to it. This was January 18th of this year, one of the few cold mornings that we had, but this morning it was cold. This was at 5:20 in the morning. At any time, MISO's got a website or a mobile app. You can look at what is feeding the load in the MISO market. It updates every 5 minutes. So I pulled this up on my phone. It was about 20 below zero where I live. I'm like, well, what's going on in MISO? About 82% of the load in MISO is being carried by coal and gas. That's generation that has to go away under this 2040 legislation in a pretty short period of time. Solar is obviously zero. It was dark. Wind at 5%. There are times where you could see wind a lot higher than that, where coal and gas might be 50, 60, and wind is 20, 25, 30. But I'll tell you, if we planned for only the good days, we'd be sitting in the dark an awful lot of the time. We have to plan for situations like this. Different situation, but I'll explain why. In this case, a few days later, 10:55 in the morning. Not as cold, wasn't dark, but it wasn't windy and it wasn't sunny through the entire MISO network. And that's Manitoba to Louisiana, that whole regional grid. Solar was 1% and wind less than 1. Again, if somebody were to say, well, you're only showing when it's dark or when it's really bad, well, load wasn't anywhere near as high here, and it wasn't dark. It wasn't as cold. But it's still an issue. It's one of those things that can and does happen. So if you put your reliance on wind and solar, and this is actually 83% coal and gas at this time. That's the intermittency I'm talking about. You need dependable baseload 24/7 generation if we're going to maintain reliability and keep things affordable. Switch into affordability, it will require a massive new build-out of infrastructure. Wind turbines and solar arrays, and then the transmission lines to get it where the load is actually used. You can't build a wind farm right in the middle of a load center. By a load center, I mean like a metropolitan area where the energy is consumed. So these things have to be geographically spread over a really, really wide footprint in areas where the transmission lines don't yet exist. That costs a lot of money to build transmission lines, and it will take a lot of them. The reason it has to be so geographically spread, if you put all your wind turbines, let's say, southwestern Minnesota or eastern North Dakota, if they're all right there, you run the risk that it's not windy right there. So you've got to try to spread them out so you're picking up wind in, at least in some portion of your footprint, you're getting generation from the wind. And the same goes with solar. The other thing this will do, existing facilities, coal plants, natural gas plants, they're going to retire early under this when they are still providing value and they're still being paid for by ratepayers. And I'm not up here telling you that we need to build new coal plants. I don't believe that. Nobody's going to do that. What I'm saying is we need to be really careful about taking those plants offline before something exists that can replace it. There's already things in play that are driving up electric rates. Tracy touched on our borrowing and interest rates. Supply chain issues she talked about. Geopolitical events as it relates to the Russia-Ukraine invasion had a major impact on natural gas prices. A lot of electricity generation, certainly in Europe and here, is natural gas based. So price fluctuations in natural gas have a major impact on energy prices in markets. And then if you look at wind, let's just use a wind farm example. Those are really capital intensive right up front. You've got to spend the money to build it before you can get any benefit. Well, they take a lot of concrete, they take a lot of steel, they take a lot of copper, they take a lot of materials to build those. So we're seeing it, the prices, you used to be able to enter into a wind contract, and by we, I mean like GRE could do this, in the upper Midwest in the 3.5 cent a kilowatt hour range, which is good. We'd be looking for 3.5 cent energy, we'd take it all day long. But now those developers are saying, you're looking closer to 7.5 cents now. In the period of a year, that cost of that wind output has doubled. And they're saying it's because of supply chain, the cost of materials, and the cost of the interest rates. They have to borrow the money to build these things. They're too expensive, and then they get that paid back over time when they're generating. And then basic supply and demand. From a supply side, we're putting hurdles on the supply of reliable electricity by doing this, making it harder. But on the demand side at the same time, we're looking to electrify more and more sectors of the economy. Like transportation is a big one you're hearing about with electric vehicles. If we start piling on demand, like stuff Mr. Grid was talking about, more and more demand for electricity. You're seeing it in lawn and garden equipment, home heating, appliances. There's a push to electrify everything. We're going to do that at the same time we're going to make it harder to get. So simple supply and demand tells you that's an increase, that creates an increase in price. Local control. Right now, Lake Country Power is governed by a locally elected board of directors. Bob is yours. If you have a problem with what Lake Country Power is doing, Bob has an obligation to listen to you. You don't like Bob's answer, you think Bob's not giving you what you need, you can run for the board. You have that, I'm not telling you to, but you have that ability in a member-owned co-op, and that decision making is done by a locally elected board of directors. They're accountable to the membership. In this legislation, there's a couple things called off-ramps, where you could say, this is just too expensive, we want out, or this is too unreliable, we want out. We won't get to make that decision locally. That decision will be made by the PUC, or the Public Utilities Commission. It's a 5-person board, sits in St. Paul, they're all appointed by the governor. They will decide for you what's affordable. They will decide for you what's acceptable for liability. So what the local control concern is, it's taking some of that decision-making authority out of our hands. A few other comments. Blackouts are a major concern. If it happens in the winter, certainly there will be property damage, frozen pipes and whatnot, but depending on the situation or duration, if it happens in the winter, people could die. A blackout is not as simple as going in your basement and flipping the breaker. Something has catastrophically failed. And Derek, the engineer in the back, he could explain more about, if voltage drops to a level, what kind of equipment damage that may do, but you could be situations of days, could be weeks if it's a large-scale blackout. What would likely happen first, though, they call rolling blackouts. The grid operators will take down portions of the system for periods of time to prevent the major collapse of the whole grid. So the grid is trending towards more and more winter peaking. That's where the public safety concern is. In the summer, it doesn't get that hot here where it's a major public safety concern. You can go to the beach, you'll probably make it. The winter is a concern, and the grid is becoming more and more winter peaking as more and more technology is shifting electric heating over towards electric, or heating over towards electric, whether it's heat pumps or other technology like that. Even Texas is shifting more towards winter peaking because of the heating element of the grid. So the battery technology that it would take doesn't exist at a scale that would make this possible. Now, there is technology like Tesla makes a power wall. You could put it in your basement, operate your house for hours, maybe 4 or 5 hours and be fine, not notice anything. But we're not talking about that type of technology. We're talking about technology that at grid scale, hundreds of megawatts, that could hold the load for days until the wind blows again or the sun shines again. That's a risk. It hasn't been developed. There's groups working on it, but it doesn't exist yet. And even if it did, let's say you were able to build a battery big enough, batteries don't make any energy. You will still have to charge it with something. So these are challenges in front of us that really, you're not hearing this from, if you watch the news, you're not hearing this, read the paper, you're not hearing this. That's why I'm up here talking about this. You need to hear this side of it too, and the concerns that we have on this. Nobody's done more than Minnesota's utilities already have as it relates to carbon emissions reduction. We were about 5% renewable generation in 2005. It's over 30% today. We were projected to be about 50% by 2035. That's the path we were on. Responsibly, maintaining reliability, maintaining affordability. 2005, we were about 65% reliant on coal. Minnesota, roughly 25% today. We're projected to be 5% by 2035. One useful piece of information too, Minnesota's utilities account for about 0.07% of global carbon emissions. So if you were to just eliminate all carbon emissions from Minnesota's utilities right now, there isn't technology that exists to measure that impact on climate or global temperature, if that's your concern. Not saying we shouldn't do that. We have been decarbonizing, but we've been doing it responsibly. But if you shut it off right now, no more carbon in Minnesota, you couldn't measure the difference even in global carbon emissions. So at what cost are we going to do this to residents in Minnesota? Shift a bit. Talk about NERC, another acronym. It's the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. What they do, they set and then monitor the reliability standards across the grid in the United States. They fall under the purview of FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, a wing of the federal government. So they issue assessments. They do seasonal assessments and long-term assessments for grid reliability. They just released this 2 months ago, in December, 3 months ago really, for their latest long-term assessment on grid reliability. We're part of that MISO area in the red in the center. That's our regional grid. And it's listed on here as high risk. High risk in periods of normal operating conditions. We're not talking peak conditions like Dan mentioned. We're not talking extreme cold. We're not talking extreme heat. By 2028, they're saying this part of the country is at a high risk for having reliability challenges. And this is an agency this is their job, is to monitor reliability and issue assessments like this. So what they said, beginning in 2028, MISO is projected to have a shortfall of 4.7 gigawatts. If the expected retirements of generators, by that coal and gas plants, if what is expected, what is planned, what has been announced, if that happens, 4.7 gigawatts short by 2028, even though it's expected to add 12 gigawatts of generation, namely wind and solar. But why that creates a problem is the intermittency I was talking about. 2028 is right in the middle of that. So to put 4.7 gigawatts in perspective, Coal Creek Station, the largest coal plant in North Dakota, is slightly over 1 gigawatt. So the shortfall we're talking is about the scale of 5 of those. 5 large coal plants is what we're projected to be short in MISO in a period of 4 years. Shift a bit from state to federal. The EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, has a power plant rule. In May of 2023, they released their draft rules aimed at coal and natural gas plants across the whole country. They're expected, a final rule on this was expected spring of this year. That's been pushed out a bit because they want to make some changes, but what I'm hearing is the changes that are being talked about make this worse, not better. So NRECA, our National Trade Association, has issued comments on this, and I'll have those on the next slide. And they've asked the EPA for a full withdrawal of this, saying this is catastrophic policy. So NRECA's comments, and this first one, don't feel bad if you never heard this word, because I hadn't either. The proposal hinges on the adoption of nascent technologies. So I had to go to dictionary.com for what is nascent. Just coming into existence and beginning to show signs of future potential. And what they're talking about here is clean hydrogen as the fuel source for generation, and then carbon capture and storage. Both of those have promise, but neither one has been, put into place. Neither have been implemented, certainly haven't been implemented successfully. There's a project in northeast North Dakota. Minn Kota Power is working on a carbon capture and sequestration project. Time will tell if that's successful or not, but they're expected to issue this rule before any of these technologies have been proven. And NRECA is saying this violates the Clean Air Act because the EPA is grabbing authority now that hasn't been given to them by Congress. So they're from an administrative state, they're taking the reins here from our elected people in Washington, D.C., who should be making that decision for us. It contains timelines that are unrealistic, unachievable. That these deadlines will endanger existing gas plants and all but ensure that existing coal plants will shut down by 2035. The infrastructure won't be able to be put in place by then. Supply chain stuff that we were talking about, permitting, transmission, all of those things are going to make this pretty much impossible to accomplish without just choosing to shut down those coal and gas plants. The same thing NRECA is saying that I've been saying at the state level. It's posing a major threat to reliability and affordability. What can we do about it? You could go to voicesforcooperativepower.com, sign up on there, you can click that Join Us button. What they ask is first and last name, email address, and a zip code. And what they'll do is then email you things that are being discussed, let you know of ways you could get involved. If there's a form letter you could send to your local legislators, they could point you in the right direction for that. And shift away from that, but I want to issue a word of caution. It's not the same, but somewhat related. We've got some bad actors operating in our territory, and we've got solar developers that are going around and knocking on our members' doors and sitting down and asking them to sign contracts that have, then they don't tell you that they could put an iPad in front of you. They make promises, we can put this on your roof, you'll never have an electric bill again. It's not realistic. They'll tell you Lake Country Power's rates are going to double in 2 or 3 years. That's not going to happen either. But they'll either put a piece of paper or an iPad in front of you, ask you to sign it or click or even just touch the iPad. What you've done at that point is entered into a contract for them to do that. And the opt-out period on some of these we've seen as short as 3 to 5 days. So if you're like, start thinking, well, what was that all about? You don't act right away, you are going to be stuck. And we've had members who've been stuck. And in a lot of cases, they're elderly members. My opinion, this is predatory, what they're doing. One case was an elderly woman, early 70s. She's locked into about an $80,000 installation on the roof of her house because she signed that contract. That's never going to pay off for her. So what she's going to have now is it operates like a mortgage to that solar developer. So she won't pay us for whatever it produces, but she's going to have to pay them for the rest of her life and beyond. And my suspicion is that developer is going to own that house eventually if something happens to her. But be aware, if somebody does that, don't sign anything, don't click anything until you talk to us. We're not going to talk you out of doing something like that, but we want you to have the accurate information of what you can expect for output, however big the system they propose for you is. We'll help you do that, help you do it the right way. If you want to do that, that's great, but we want you to have all the information before you do that. And these companies, there's a couple of them, they aren't giving you the option to do that. So please call us before you enter into anything like that. A few last things from me and I'll shut up. Power supply tour. Remember several years ago we used to jump on a bus and drive out to North Dakota and tour Coal Creek Station. GRE no longer owns Coal Creek Station, but we want to bring back some sort of member tour. So in August of this year, get on a bus, you can go down, see GRE's headquarters in Maple Grove. The really interesting part of that is to see the ACES Northern Trading Center, and what ACES is. GRE's a member of ACES. They do a lot of the power marketing. I mean, it looks like walking into mission control at NASA. There's screens all over where they're looking at output from power plants and what is the cost of that output, and they're placing energy hedges. Say, well, I'm going to place a day ahead order on this because we think the price will be less than it is right now. Pretty interesting operation. So the ACES thing will be interesting. You can go see there's a peaking station in Elk River, not far up the road from there, and then we'll take you to a Twins game. So registration is towards the end of July for that. Get RSVP to Tammy back there if it's something you want to do. $155 a person, pretty reasonable. Includes transportation and the Twins game and the tours. Project Green Touch. This one's in May up at McCarthy Beach State Park in Side Lake. I need a group of volunteers willing to go help clean up the park. And not unlike what I'm looking out here or your yards. When the snow melts, it leaves a mess behind. I got sticks all over, and what this group does, you'll help clean up the park, do some raking, and we'll clean up. So we need some volunteers to help with that. Same thing, you can talk to Tammy if you're interested in doing that. Last thing for me, our annual meeting is April 25th up in Mountain Iron this year. I realize that's quite a ways from Remer, but if you're around on that evening and can drive up to Mountain Iron, we'd be happy to see you up there. So